Committee of the School of Public Health Graduate Student Council. And we really wanted to continue our series on police power and community health, or public health, but today we're specifically going to be focusing on the influence of police presence on community health. And Ms. Lauren Bonds, Legal Director of the National Police Accountability Project, will be leading us through this presentation and discussion. So just a few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted just to avoid any distractions. And also, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them to me in the chat if you don't feel comfortable speaking out loud. Yeah, so I'm just gonna start us off with a brief little introduction of our speaker. Ms. Lauren Bonds is the Legal Director of the National Police Accountability Project. Prior to joining NPAP, Lauren was the Legal Director of the ACLU Kansas. Before her time with the ACLU, Lauren served as an Assistant General Counsel at the Service Employees International Union, where she provided legal support to the union's fight for $15 campaign. She has also represented low-income workers in employment and civil rights litigation, including voting rights cases in Alabama and North Carolina. Lauren, who received her law degree from Duke University, held summer positions at the Texas Civil Rights Project and Equal Rights Advocates, and she has also participated in Duke University's Guantanamo Defense Clinic. So with that said, let's get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Brianna, and for all of you guys for letting me come and speak with you today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and y'all please bear with me. I should be better at Google Slides at this point in my life, but there's still a struggle. So okay, and I will go ahead and present. Okay. So, as Brianna mentioned, I'm with the National Police Accountability Project, and I'm really excited to talk about, some of the places where policing impacts public health and community health, and also some of the areas where I think policymaking can intersect. I think it might be helpful if I start off by telling you a little bit about MPAP, so you can have a good sense of kind of the work we do and how we approach these questions and kind of the direction of our work in this area. So we're an organization that's been around as a project of the National Lawyers Guild since 1999. So we're coming up just a little over 2 decades now. And a lot of our focus has traditionally been on, police and correctional officer misconduct. I think we wade out of those areas and reach into general civil rights issues from time to time. But for the most part, we've been focused on policing since our inception. And I think that makes us a little different from a lot of other civil rights legal organizations and advocacy organizations. Traditionally, we've been really focused on supporting our members in bringing civil rights lawsuits against police officers who violate constitutional rights or tort laws. Recently, we've expanded a little bit, and I want to just take a very short step back and say that I think we think there's incredible value in individual lawsuits against individual officers and police departments. These kinds of lawsuits can, change departmental policies. They can result, if it's by the federal government, a lawsuit that they bring, it can result in a consent decree that has a real binding impact. But in the wake of the uprising this summer, and I think the broad calls for change and the recognition that policing is in deep need of reform, we've really seen an opportunity in the last year to pursue more transformative and systemic change. And I think the ways that we've decided that we can do that is through supporting appellate processes and legislative advocacy. So what I'll be talking about mainly today is our legislative advocacy work. I think there are a lot of different ways that we can influence policing in a way that it's going to have positive community and public health outcomes in the courts, but it's a little bit more attenuated if we do it that way. So I'll definitely be talking mostly about legislative advocacy today. The main areas that I'm going to be focusing on, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are kind of the areas where we feel are amenable to legislative advocacy in particular. So one area that, or kind of more more limited municipal policy change. So one area that I think is obviously where there's obviously kind of an intersection and impact between policing and public health is in the space of police brutality, where people are injured by excessive use of force. And I think the main way that we are going to talk about changing that is through use of force standards and legislation in that area. But I think that's kind of the most obvious area where we've been able to kind of dip our toe in and start doing work. Over police communities, we see public health impacts of over policing in the outcome of over incarceration. And I think there's a lot of things that our members at NPAP are working on where there's a deep intersection, and we've been reaching out to public health experts as experts in our litigation in ways that we haven't in the past. And then finally, police budgets and kind of this question of how police budgets impact funding of other types of programs that could have ramifications for health more broadly. So I'll start with police brutality. I think it's important to note some features. So police brutality in use of force is incredibly prevalent. On average, there are 600,000 uses of force per year in civilian and police interactions. For those of you who are better at math, you probably don't need this breakdown set out, but that breaks down to 1,500 per day or once every minute. And 90% of those incidences where force is used, it's not for a reason related to officer self-defense. It's because someone's allegedly being non-compliant. It might be some other issue. So these statistics all come from a really brilliant attorney and researcher, Seth Stoughton, who wrote this great book evaluating police use of force. So even though the data isn't kind of the publicly available data on use of force isn't great, he's done a really great study and has been able to figure this out. Police use of force is incredibly racialized, and this is not exclusive to Black people, but I think they are statistically and empirically the group that are most impacted. So 1 in 1,000 men are going to die from police violence is what the studies are showing. Black women are 3 times more likely to be subject to a use of force in a run-of-the-mill police stop than a white woman or a white passing woman. And so, this, I think that's important to note. And then I'd also note that there are kind of these disparate impacts on people with mental health conditions. And that kind of runs the gamut of people who might be under the influence or suffering from substance abuse addiction, someone who might be dealing with autism, someone who might be having some kind of psychotic episode. Folks who have mental health conditions are much more likely to be met with force when they have an interaction with a police officer than someone who doesn't have a diagnosed or recognized mental health condition. And so, the outcomes of use of force are what you might expect, and what we've been seeing in the news a lot. It's death, it's serious injuries, and kind of outside of that, it's mental trauma. Even if the force isn't significant enough to result in a serious injury. There's been, a lot of documented studies explaining, all the ways that this will increase anxiety in people who had the interaction. And even if you haven't had the interaction, if you're worried about your family members, it can create kind of a generalized anxiety outside of, folks who may directly be targeted or have an interaction with the police. So the law here, the policies here, there's not a national standard for use of force. To the extent there is one, it comes from the constitutional interpretations of our Supreme Court. The case Graham v. Connor is the situation in which the Supreme Court said you can use force as long as it's objectively reasonable and proportional to the threat. That was later interpreted in the context of deadly force, and the Supreme Court said, once again, you can use it if it's objectively reasonable and proportional to the threat you're experiencing. Deadly use of force has been validated in situations other than when the law enforcement officer's life is in danger or there's a imminent danger to the person or someone around them, and that's just something that I think people should know in terms of when our legal system permits these types of uses of force. Outside of, to the extent there are additional restrictions on when force can be used that go above the constitutional standard, those are usually going to be found in municipal police policies. There aren't a lot of those that are in place right now. And so unfortunately, it's usually that constitutional standard. Did the police officer, reasonably anticipate a threat or reasonably perceive a threat? And I think one of the things about this reasonableness standard, and this is something that's so obnoxious for lawyers, and is that it creates a shield from liability for law enforcement officers who make mistakes. And as long as someone would say it's a high stress situation, that's a reasonable mistake someone would make. And there's a lot of deference given to police officers when they're deciding whether they need to use force or not. And I think this has come up a lot in cases. You hear about these cases of people, being murdered by the police or killed by the police. And, it's a situation where the police officer mistook someone's cell phone as a weapon. And you're like, how is that person not liable, right? It's because of this reasonable use of force standard, and that their reasonable perception, and the fact that the court is going to credit the fact that they were in a high stress situation and people can make mistakes. So, I think the way that we're seeing this addressed in a lot of situations is through state laws. So there have been about 30 bills in state legislatures proposed this year so far that ban certain types of uses of force. So chokehold bans are something that we're seeing a lot in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Prior to currently, there is no recognition that chokeholds are deadly force, which is crazy because they kill people a lot. But this is kind of taking a step further and finding the recognition that that this is a deadly use of force and can only be used in a very small set of circumstances. Taser training. I think some of the more successful advocates in reforming municipal police efforts have really pushed for tasers, but then we're seeing situations where they're being used improperly that's resulting in death or serious injury. So there's been a number of bills proposed to get rid of tasers, or make sure that tasers are used only in limited situations and properly. And then I would also note that there's a lot of legislation working on ending qualified immunity, and that's not a direct use of force standard alteration, but it does open up the ability for people to bring more civil rights actions. And as I mentioned when we started, civil rights actions can be, individual civil rights actions can be incredibly helpful in changing how police officers operate and how departments operate. So I want to take a moment and just note the very exciting, expansive omnibus policing legislation that's currently pending in the U.S. Senate. It passed the U.S. House, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Now, there's a lot of really great things in this bill, and a lot of things that address the use of force. But one thing I do want to note, and I think one of the issues that I think policymakers confront a lot when they're trying to make national change and change at the federal level, is there's very little, unfortunately, that the federal legislature can do to impact policing. A lot of the restrictions that you're hearing about in this bill, that it's going to ban chokeholds, that it's going to end no-knock warrants, that's going to do all these things, it's only applying to federal police officers. And that's not an insignificant group in America, but that is not the majority of police officers. Some of the provisions in the bill do make as a grant condition that you have to adopt, that police departments, in order to get federal grant funding, they have to adopt certain standards around use of force. They have to ban chokeholds, they have to ban no-knock warrants, and that can be effective, but it's not the same thing as just like Biden's not going to be able to kind of like sign the bill and say police officers are no longer going to be able to use chokeholds. Like that's going to be something that police departments may individually do in order to get grant funding, but it's not something that is going to be in and of itself nationally solved with the passage of this bill. Excuse me. So I want to pivot now and talk a little bit about how policing contributes to over-incarceration. And the Vera Institute has done a lot of really great research on kind of the ways that policing results in over-incarceration, and over-incarceration results in both negative health impacts for the people who are incarcerated, but also their communities. And so I think a lot of this is not, it's kind of logical and pretty straightforward, so I won't spend too much time on it, but over policing creates a higher risk of incarceration because, unfortunately, if there are more police contacts, particularly in communities of color, there's significant data that that's going to result in a higher volume of arrest and more people who end up in jail and prisons. And jail typically is pretrial detention before you've had your case adjudicated, and then prison is where you go after you have a conviction. So. This is probably not news to people who work in public health, but health of incarcerated people is significantly compromised vis-a-vis people who are at liberty and out in the community. So they're more likely to be subject to infectious disease transmission. In this over the last year, our members have filed so many cases to seek compassionate release for folks who are incarcerated right now because it's a death sentence for some people with significant health complications, the risk of exposure to COVID. Even before COVID, tuberculosis, HIV, Hep C, all of these different infectious diseases are being transmitted at much higher rates in carceral facilities. And when folks cycle out of prison and jail, their communities are more likely to contract these diseases once they're out. So that's one of the major areas where incarceration can impact people's health. Exacerbation of mental illness. 1 in 3 people who die in jails in America die from suicide. These are folks who had pre-existing mental health conditions that were triggered or made worse when they were incarcerated. And folks who are in post-conviction facilities and prisons are more likely to develop chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes. And then, kind of taking it outside of the individuals who are being policed or who are being incarcerated, it has a negative impact on their families. There's pretty well documentation of all the negative impacts on social determinants of health that incarceration has on communities. Family structure is broken down. There's a higher likelihood of intergenerational poverty, and also, the disenfranchisement of people with felony convictions results in less resources coming to people's communities. So that it's a really significant impact. And unfortunately, I think the best way that we can address this from a policy standpoint is to make sure that we are allocating fewer resources or engaging in different types of policing practices. Right now, the broken windows policing philosophy that is still prevalent in a lot of police departments. And for those of you who don't know, broken windows policing is kind of the concept of you're going to have safer, better communities if you go out and address every single thing. If you go and write citations for broken windows, if you go and arrest the jaywalker, if you arrest the young man who's glaring at a cop on a corner, what have you, that enforcing these kind of low-level minor offenses is going to result in safer communities. And that requires having more police on the streets, that requires a greater police presence, particularly in communities where there's a lot of poverty. And I think that it's really critical that there's a readjustment of how we think about policing and whether we think that that's a good tactic. And I think kind of all this rolls into our next kind of the last category of policy changes I'm going to talk about, and that is that's the broken windows. That's this movement to defund the police. And I'll say from the outset that INPAP doesn't have a formal position on defund as a political movement. We do have one as to the extent it's a policy objective, right? And defund for those who don't know or who maybe have heard kind of the politicized definitions, as far as we're aware, defunding the police means reallocating resources from police budgets to other areas of municipal government. And that that has become such a hot button issue, but I think it's a fairly straightforward idea. And I don't think it's necessarily premised on the fact that municipal budgets are zero-sum games. I think they kind of are, but you only have so much money in a budget. But at the same time, I think where municipalities are investing and hiring and putting support is going to significantly impact, who are the municipal employees who are interacting with people. And I think that goes back to broken windows. If funding is allocated more towards other public officials who are able to address different community ills, it's less likely to be a police officer who's out on the street, who's out writing tickets, who's increasing these interactions and ultimately increasing incarceration. So the American Public Health Association has recommended defunding, or specifically redistribution of law enforcement funding to social services and structures. Sorry, I know I'm blocking half of the page here. Structures to address inequity and meet human need through, for example, jobs, housing, transportation, healthcare, and youth programs. So I think that this is an idea that, if we're investing in these other things that can improve the social determinants of health, if we're investing in other things that can directly impact individuals' health, that's going to lead to healthier communities. And police departments are eating up huge parts of budgets in a lot of cities. In some cities it's over 40%. I think that's one on the higher end, but traditionally 25 to 30% is pretty typical for a large American city for a police budget. And just thinking about how many millions of dollars that works out to be, and how many different areas that can be funded. So I think one of the major limitations of this reallocation of municipal resources is that it's become really politicized. I think we'll start there. It's become really politicized. I think if you had the opportunity to kind of hear any of the debate around the George Floyd bill that I mentioned, that you really are hearing a lot of even progressive Democrats trying to distance themselves from defund, which is their prerogative, but I think it's been problematic, right? And then I also think that this is not a solution that our executives in the federal government have endorsed. President Biden during his campaign and subsequently has stuck with his commitment that he wants to put $300 million into the plan for community-oriented policing. And so that not only is not going to result in reallocation of funds because more funds are going to the policing budget, but also I think it's just reinforcing this idea that police are the ideal frontline public official to be interacting with civilians who are in crisis, regardless of whether there's a public safety concern or something that requires their participation and presence. So that's one thing that I think is folks should be aware of. The Fraternal Order of Police and police unions obviously are fighting back against any of these efforts in a very real way. We've been seeing this play out in different municipalities where this has gotten a lot of traction, including East Lansing, Michigan, which was one of the first places that came out and kind of pointed out all the ways that some of the proposals and provisions around this would result in the violation of their union contracts. And then I think kind of the latest and most novel thing that we've seen is these state bills coming out that are preempting municipal efforts to reallocate funding. So a number of state legislators have introduced legislation that is limiting that is banning a municipality's ability to reallocate more. In some states, it's more than 30% of their funding. And it's actually made it pretty far in Indiana and Mississippi, 2 states. And you might say like, oh, what's cool going on in those places? But Jackson, Mississippi actually has an incredibly progressive city government. Chokwe Lumumba is, I think, a really effective, local mayor who would be able to get this passed in Jackson. who's now having to deal with this other, potential threat and other argument about why police budgets shouldn't be reallocated. And so I think we're seeing it really having an impact. And unfortunately, I think some of the barriers to this particular reform that would benefit, policing, policing, I think more generally, but policing as it impacts public health specifically in a really negative way. So I'm happy to talk about any of those specific areas I highlighted. I'm happy to talk about new areas. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to make this more of a discussion. But yeah, that's kind of the general landscape right now as we're looking at this from a legislative perspective.
Well, first and foremost, I just want to say, Lauren, thank you so much for your presentation. I mean, oh, I'm sorry. Anna, do you have a question? Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, this is just a really important topic, just talking about reallocating funds into the community to kind of eliminate some of these disparities that marginalized communities are facing. That was really all I was going to say. This is a really great presentation, and I'm so thankful that you came and just, gave us some background.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It's always affirming to see that people are working on this topic, and it's not just a news cycle conversation every couple of months. My question is in particular, I'll call them hotspots. So I used to live in Baltimore City, and our police department is one of the most fascinating, I'll use that word. Most of the police officers come from the county because the city pays more, and there's a lot of policing in specific neighborhoods. I was wondering, from a public health standpoint, are there specific areas in the country that we should be paying close attention to, or using our advocacy voice to target? Because I can imagine Baltimore, Chicago, I don't know if any others. I don't want to place stigma on those places either, because there's great people there. So
yeah. I think that's a really great question. And, I think some of the places where we've been focusing the most when we're thinking about our advocacy are the places with the highest rates of use of force. And Baltimore is, as you've identified, one of those areas. I think also, Albuquerque and in New Mexico is an area where we've seen a ton of deaths by police and violence by police. In LA is another place. So I think there are definitely hotspots, and that's kind of where we've been focusing, at least our advocacy efforts around use of force standards. I think the question kind of around where can we influence municipal policy making, and kind of the allocation of resources, or maybe just getting police departments to adopt different standards, or city council to adopt those standards for them. We've really been trying to look in places where there's really bold leadership. And I say that because I think I come from unions. I'm not here to disparage unions, but the power that police unions have is just insurmountable, I think, in a lot of places. And they're going to block anything that's going to that's going to make them have to work harder to do their job, which anything that's going to restrict their use of force, that's going to restrict the number of people who are, deployed to police, is going to hurt their job. So really somewhere where we have someone who's not in their pocket, I think, is where I would focus those efforts, just because I think you're going to get the most bang for your buck there. But that's a really good question.
We also have a question in the chat. I'm going to read out loud just in case anyone's not looking at the chat. From a public health standpoint, do you think that reallocation of funding for the police might be better used in the mental health arena?
That is a great question. I think it's an unequivocal yes answer there. We've seen, some really good pilot projects of this. Eugene, Oregon is one place in particular. They have a program called Cahoots, which I'll never remember what the acronym stands for, but it's CAHOOTS. And they've done just that, right? So I don't think, they've necessarily cut the number of Eugene police officers, but they have decided to invest in these kind of crisis response, immediate, like actor type social workers with significant public health training or mental health training and counseling experience to respond to individuals who are in crisis. And in 80% of those situations, and it hasn't been in place long, I just have to, sorry to break with the with the caveat there. It's only been, I think, in operation since 2015, but in 80% of the situations where Cahoots has responded, they've been able to resolve it without calling police for backup. So I think that really shows how effective that could be, particularly as we're seeing so many, so much of a need for someone to be able to de-escalate a person who is in crisis, but also that we're seeing when the police are the ones who do that, how often it ends in violence and unfortunately death. So I think that's exactly, I think, where we should be thinking when we're thinking about reallocation. And I would just note in addition to kind of crisis response, like ongoing treatment and making sure that municipalities are contributing to that in a meaningful way is important too, whether that's through funding ongoing mental health and substance abuse counseling for diversion programs or other things like that. That just to say that I think there's a broader range of ways that money could be reinvested as opposed to just kind of responding to something once it's happening that's more sustainable.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
Hi, Ms. Bonds. I was wondering if you feel comfortable talking a little bit more about your experience working with police unions or against police unions. If you have like any anecdotes to share, kind of, I mean, I wouldn't call them fun tidbits, but like the most aggravating kind of caveats of, working against a police union that you've come kind of in contact with.
Sure. No, I think that's a really good question. And I would say, the majority of situations that I've seen this in have been in the legislative sphere, right? In the past, when we've sued, individual police officers, I'm usually just working with their attorney. So I don't know kind of like what the union rep is doing behind the scenes. But I think, kind of anecdotally, I think something that we see a lot is it's not, I think there's always kind of a very extreme messaging that is very effective, right? That police officers use to combat reform legislation, and police unions are going to say, this is going to be really difficult. Like we're going to lose people who are going to want to be police officers. People are going to quit the force. People are going to retire early. You're putting our lives at risk. And I think in addition to kind of that rhetoric, they're just really well organized and really well funded, right? Like they have a really tight voting block, which is even though I think a lot of unions do that, they're really powerful because they're so disciplined. If they're saying like, we're going to vote this mayor out, we're going to organize a strike, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, it's just really effective. And I think a big part of that is because, a lot of members of the public support police officers, they should. But I think that just makes their union particularly effective in the political sphere.
Okay, we have 2 questions in the chat. I'm just gonna read the first one that popped up. What can we do as ordinary citizens to support the work that you are doing and your organization?
Oh, thank you. So I think, one of the best ways I think that folks can get involved right now, particularly on the legislative front, is to, call in and actually contact your representative or senator. I think this is particularly helpful in at the state level, because people don't really do that, right? Like, you always see all these like ads, call your congressman, call your senator. That results in usually like about 5% of registered voters actually reaching out. So when you do get someone on the phone, particularly if they're middle of the road, or if you get their staffer on the phone, it actually will make a difference in a lot of situations. So I know some of you guys probably aren't, or most of you guys probably aren't all registered to vote in Rhode Island. Maybe you're registered in your home states or wherever, but I think just kind of following along, and we try to do a good job on our website of keeping the legislation more backing up in front and center. So I think doing that kind of extra democratic step of contacting your elected official can be incredibly helpful. I also just think, though, that I think anything that you can do to support the movement and organizing work that's going on, that doesn't directly support our organization. We're very much in the legal legislative advocacy space, but the opportunities that we're seeing in the courts and legislatures wouldn't have happened if it weren't for organizers and activists and the people not only who got out and put their feet in the street this summer, but have been doing that since 2013, since 1991, since forever. So I think when you feel safe showing up for those marches and those protests, and I think that it seems like you're just kind of showing up and getting in the street sometimes, but I think it has such an incredible impact on our ability to change policy.
Okay, there's also another question. What are your thoughts about the value of and challenges of recruiting a police force that looks like the community they serve?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I think there could be a lot of value in it. I think a lot of times when when police departments are just like, okay, we need to just start recruiting more people from the community, we're putting those officers in a situation where they're not set up to succeed and change the environment, right? Like, if they're coming into the system that's the system it is, and you're just kind of sprinkling some black and brown officers in there, it's not going to go very far. They're going to quit. They're going to develop a problematic perspective of their own community, or they're going to have a terrible time and get disillusioned with their job, right? And eventually quit. So I think that I think that's a definite challenge of being able to recruit people is we're putting them in a situation where they're not going to succeed. I think they can be incredibly valuable, though, but I think it also almost has to start at leadership needs to change in order for folks with different perspectives who are going to come in and as rank and file to really be able to change the culture of a police department and have a meaningful impact, and make sure that bringing the community in the police department results in something that looks more like community-oriented policing, as opposed to just kind of run-of-the-mill, but with black and brown faces. But I think that's a really good question, and I think a struggle that unfortunately unions haven't been helpful in addressing either, just because I think seniority and ranks are so tight, and I also just think that unfortunately there's still a huge problem with race discrimination within police unions and fraternal orders of police. That is a great documentary.
Oh, is it okay if I ask a question? I didn't know if there was one that was okay. Hi, Ms. Bonds. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us, and also for the work that you do, which is extremely important. My question is, do you think that the kind of privatization of prisons has kind of impacted this model of trying to reduce over policing, and essentially defunding the police and reallocating those funds towards the different programs for communities that you were talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think, these prison privatization efforts have, I think like the results of that are different in different states. I think we've definitely seen, governors who have entered into these agreements with CoreCivic and other, kind of private prison companies, and they've been like, wow, this is a huge waste of money. We have this long contract with them, like we're never doing it again. And like, we're not going to try to, throw good money after bad money, so to speak, and try to fill these prisons, right? I think I will acknowledge that there are a lot of electeds and who have made that determination. However, I do think that you are identifying a real issue where there's a bit of an incentive to fill prisons that you're paying for in a way. And so I think that while I don't think there's probably like an easy direct line, like I think it'd be really hard for someone to do a study and show that like, there's causation here. When you build private prisons, then, police are going to work to fill them, or, that's going to be a directive that elected officials give to police. But I think that, empirically, we have heard about that happening, right? So it's not helpful to the goals of reallocation and refocusing on what policing should be, for sure. That was a great question.
Are there any other questions or comments, or even just like discussion points that anyone wants to share? If not, that's totally understandable.
All right. Well, I know you guys are at the end of your day on the East Coast, so I appreciate you joining me for it.
Yes, thank you so much for coming. If you guys have any questions about the work that Lauren does with the National Police Accountability Project, feel free to reach out to us. We can give the contact information, or we'll find a way to get you in contact with Lauren and her team. But thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate this presentation. Like I said, just really insightful and really, really important, especially for what's kind of going on right now. So thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, Lauren, for presenting.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Thank you, Brianna.
No problem. All right, bye everyone.